Hi, everyone. I have that it's 12 o'clock. Kara, do you want us to go ahead and get started?
Sure, yes, we can. People can join us as we go on.
Great. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cheryl Leary. I am the Director of Planning and Community Development at HESCO. HESCO is the Area Agency on Aging and Aging Service Access Point for 12 communities in South Norfolk County. Welcome to our webinar in recognition of World Elder Abuse Awareness Day. Before we get started, I would just ask people to keep themselves on mute, as I know many of you are viewing from busy workplaces. I would also ask that you keep your video on if possible. It is much easier for our speakers when they see their audience. Please note that we are recording the webinar so that we can post it to the HESCO YouTube channel. I will be monitoring the chat and managing the Zoom. So please use the chat to enter any questions that you may have as we move through the presentation. We have time at the end of the session for our presenters to answer all questions. As this is a difficult topic, please be mindful not to share personal details about specific situations in the chat or verbally in order to protect the confidentiality of parties involved. With that, I will introduce Kara Fink, who is our Protective Services Program Director. Kara has over a decade of experience in the protective services field in Massachusetts. Please take it away, Kara.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. I just want to, thank everybody for joining us here. Today is World Elder Abuse Awareness Day, and it is really celebrated around the world to really bring attention to the serious issue that is elder abuse and look what can we do as a community to build strong support for our elders. Today's presentation, we're going to focus on recognizing what the signs of elder abuse are, as well as minimizing the impact. The presenters today will be myself, Courtney Snyder, who is one of our supervisors, and Aletha Michelle, who is our other supervisor. So I'm going to start us off. I'm going to launch us into sort of an overview of the problem of elder abuse. What are risk factors? Who's most at risk? What's the cost? Aletha will then go into what are the different kinds of allegations that we in Massachusetts look at. And then what are some potential indicators that you can be on the lookout for? And then Courtney will finish us up with what do we do once we recognize signs of elder abuse and what is our process for helping elders. So thank you again for joining us. As Cheryl said, if you have any questions, just put them in the chat at the end. We will try to answer whatever questions we can. Next slide, Cheryl. Okay. So as Cheryl said, we are the HESCO is the area agency access point for the towns of Canton, Dedham, Foxborough, Medfield, Millis, Norfolk, Norwood, Plainville, Sharon, Walpole, Westwood, and Rentham. So the Protective Service Program covers these specific towns. Every town does have a agency that is designated to receive protective service reports and respond to them across the state. We intervene in situations where self-neglect, abuse, or exploitation or neglect are impacting the elder and putting them at risk. And this source can be intentional. It can also be unintentional, which we'll get into in a little bit, especially in terms of neglect. But it can take many forms, and including but not limited to physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional or verbal abuse, medical neglect, financial exploitation, as well as a big one that we are seeing a huge increase in right now is scams for the self-neglect piece. Next slide. I want to start us off, though, with helping everybody sort of understand the framework that we use in making decisions about cases. There's 4 points. It's called the theory of adult protection, and it's how we decide sort of moving through a case what we're going to do next. The first point is that when interests compete, the adult client is the only person that PS is charged to serve, not the community concerned about safety, the landlords concerned about their property, citizens concerned about crime or morality, or families concerned about their own health or finances. So the elder is our client. And when these interests compete, the adult client is the one who's in charge of decision making. They have the right to make decisions about themselves unless they've delegated to someone else or it's been delegated for them by the court system. The third point is, and this is often the one that's the hardest for everybody to wrap their heads around and sometimes deal with in cases, it's that freedom is more important than safety. So a person can choose to live in harm or even self-destructively, providing they're competent to choose so, do not harm others, and commit no crime. People have the right to make poor choices. And in the ideal case, the protection of elders seeks to achieve simultaneously and in order of importance, freedom, safety, least disruption of lifestyle, and least restrictive care alternative. It really is a balancing act in each case. And it does really come down to, if the elder has the capacity to make decisions about themselves, then, they can choose to agree or follow our suggestions or not, but ultimately the decision is in their hands. Next slide, please. So to give a little overview of the scope of the problem of elder abuse, about 1 in 10 Americans over the age of 60 have experienced some form of abuse. We also know that elder abuse is significantly underreported. Some of the most recent statistics show that for every known elder abuse case, there are 24 unknown cases out there. For financial exploitation, it gets even worse. Only 1 of 45 cases are actually reported. Next slide. So when we look at the numbers that are coming in, for example, in fiscal year 2021, there were over 35,000 reports for protective services filed. And we know that Massachusetts has 1.3 million residents over the age of 60. Clearly, while we are getting a lot of reports, we know that it's underreported, and there could be and should be a lot more reports being made out there for our residents. So there are many Massachusetts residents where their abuse, neglect, their financial exploitation went unnoticed or unreported. Next slide, please. So who is most at risk when it comes to being abused? First and foremost are people suffering from dementia. That is one of the highest risk factors for somebody to be potentially abused or neglected. In one study in the US, abuse and neglect was detected in 47% of caregivers that were surveyed. That's staggering. That's almost half the populations who are caring for elderly, for someone with dementia, admitting that they have been abusive or neglectful of their loved one. In these cases, verbal abuse, neglect, and physical abuse were most common. Another population that is often at higher risk are people of color. This is due to historical oppression and institutional racism. These things can prevent elders from seeking help and from the abuse being reported. They also can be very not very trustful in terms of reporting to authorities or trust that the people will actually do the right thing for them. So they tend not to report as much because they don't think things will be followed through on. So this puts them at greater risk. Next slide. Also at great risk is the LGBTQ plus community. Here, social isolation is an increased risk factor in general, but this population tends to be more isolated in general, and especially the older cohort at this time with what they have lived through and dealt with. So they tend to be more isolated, which does increase their risk. One study showed that 68% of LGBTQ plus elders had experienced some form of verbal harassment. 43% had experienced threats of violence. And again, they experience higher rates of discrimination that then keep them from seeking help. They don't necessarily trust that they're going to be listened to or they're going to be respected. There's also an increased caregiver stress because of the isolation that increases the risk for abuse and neglect. There's not necessarily a strong community or strong informal support network for these caregivers, which then increases the risk of abuse and neglect. Next slide. So what are some of the risk factors in general that we know of for somebody who might be abused? One, as I said earlier, is isolation. That is probably the number one risk factor for somebody potentially being abused. Not having a very strong support network, not having the ability to really reach out for help. Chronic disease is another risk factor, particularly neurological diseases or endocrine diseases. Poor physical health in general leaves someone at risk of being abused or neglected.
Laura, do you want lunch from them?
Cognitive impairment is another risk factor, as well as lower socioeconomic status and poor mental health as well are other additional risk factors for somebody to be abused or neglected in the community. Next slide. So the cost of elder abuse. The reality is the impact of elder abuse doesn't just impact the individual elder, it impacts the community in general. We know from studies that victims are twice as likely to be hospitalized. This obviously increases medical costs, increases insurance costs. We also know that the annual financial loss due to exploitation is $2.9 billion. That's annually our loss to a form of exploitation. We know that victims are more likely to die sooner than non-victims. As I said, the increased health and legal costs, those impact the community in general. And most importantly, it reduces the elders' participation in the life of the community, and the community in general then suffers. We all have wisdom and input to give to the community and things to share with our community at large, and elder abuse prevents our elders, who probably have the most wisdom and things to speak into the community, from fully participating in the life of the community, and therefore the community it suffers. So that's just a brief overview. I could go on a lot more about the cost and risk factors and things, but that just gives a little brief overview as to, what are potential risk factors, what's the cost of this, why should we care about elder abuse. Elisa is now going to take over, and she's going to walk you through our allegations and potential indicators of those allegations.
Good afternoon. Next slide, Cheryl. So I'm going to discuss some of the allegations that we receive as reports filed. One is physical abuse, and this is the non-accidental infliction of serious physical injury to an elder, or the threat of serious physical injury in which there is reasonable cause to believe that an individual may have the intent and capacity to carry out the threat. This does include, as well as, impulsive acts, which are considered non-accidental. Next slide. Some of the indicators of physical abuse would be bruises and welts, burns, broken bones, soft tissue injuries, especially those that are unexplained and consistent with injuries reported. Hypervigilance of an abuser's actions is another indicator of physical abuse. Next slide. Emotional abuse is another allegation that we often come across and receive reports on. And this is non-accidental infliction of serious emotional injury to an elder. Emotional abuse must establish a relationship between the abusive actions, behaviors, or language and resulting effect on the emotional state of functioning of the elder. Next slide. Some of the possible indicators for emotional abuse are depression, withdrawal, agitation, which we often hear about, crying, shaking, trembling, exaggerated fear response, exacerbation of mental health or medical conditions. It happens quite often. Suicidal talk, or just simply saying wanting to die. Unusual changes in the elder's behavior or sleep patterns, and also increased anxiety are indicators of possible emotional abuse. Next slide.
Lisa, can I just jump in for a second?
Yes.
Just one thing I want to share about emotional abuse is we have to, again, the connection between the abuser's actions and the impact on the elder. we all know families that their method of communication is basically screaming at each other, and that's just how they communicate. We wouldn't necessarily say that that was emotional abuse unless there was an impact on the elder. If, let's say that, that is their communication pattern, but an elder develops a dementia and can no longer sort of fight back or, keep up with them, and now it's starting to have an impact, well, then we might consider it emotional abuse. But we do take into consideration, what are people's communication patterns, and how do they interact?
Thank you, Kara. Another allegation that we often see is sexual abuse. And this is a sexual assault, rape, sexual misuse, or sexual exploitation of an elder, or threats of sexual abuse, where the individual has the intent and capacity to carry out the threat. Next slide. Some of the possible indicators of sexual abuse are pain, itching, bruising, bleeding in genital areas, torn, stained, bloody underclothing, difficulty walking or sitting, stated fear of abuser for unexplained reasons, unexplained sexually transmitted diseases, the elder reporting being upset while being changed, bathed, or examined. And then there's also coded disclosures. That is often, signs that to look out for when this topic or an elder is reporting this allegation.
An example of a coded disclosure in a case that I was involved in, the elder just made sort of a cryptic statement to a provider that, quote, bad things happen at night. So something that doesn't quite come out and say what's happening, but might give an impression that something is happening. That's what we mean by coded disclosures.
Thank you. Next slide, Cheryl. Neglect. Neglect is another allegation that we receive protective service reports on. And this is the failure or refusal by a caretaker or caregiver to provide one or more of the necessities essential of physical well-being, such as food, clothing, shelter, personal care, medical care, which has resulted in or where there is substantial reason to believe that such a failure or refusal will immediately result in serious physical harm to an elder. And just note, and just so you're aware of, a caregiver must be competent and over the age of 18 for to have this allegation. Some of the common indicators of neglect that is often seen is dehydration, malnutrition, inadequate or improper clothing, ulcers or skin rashes, inadequate supervision or medical care, unsanitary living conditions, clutter, hoarding, the lack of medical aids such as their glasses, assistive devices such as walkers, canes, rollators, and their hearing aids. Next slide. Financial exploitation, as you've heard, is one of the biggest ones that we do receive. And this is a non-accidental act or omission by another person without the consent of the elder, causing substantial monetary or property loss to the elder or substantial monetary or property gain to the other person, which may result of consent obtained as a result of misrepresentation, undue influence, coercion, or threat of force. Next slide. Some of the indicators for financial exploitation that we've seen is unusual changes in bank account or money management, unusual sudden changes in a will or financial documents, fraudulent signatures, unpaid bills, family residing with elder but not financially contributing, and eviction due to unpaid rent. Next slide. Self-neglect is when an elder is unable to meet one's essential needs for food, clothing, safe and secure shelter, personal care, supervision, and medical care due to mental health or physical impairments, such substance abuse or cultural and linguistic barriers, and unable to remain safely in the community without assistance. Next slide. Some of the indicators for self-neglect is unsanitary living conditions, such as hoarding or lack of heat, hot water, electricity, eviction, condemnation, pending due to non-payment or state of apartment or home. Participation in lottery, sweepstakes, scams to extent that cannot meet their own needs. We do receive a lot of scams, frauds and scams. Inadequate and proper clothing, dehydration, and malnutrition. And
Good
now,
afternoon.
sorry, Courtney.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Courtney. I'm the other supervisor here. So now I'm going to go through kind of now that you know all the signs and the allegations. What do you do? So if you do suspect that an elder is the victim of elder abuse, there are two ways to report in Massachusetts. There's a 24-hour hotline number, which is a centralized intake unit that goes to the appropriate, they make sure that the report goes to the appropriate agency, depending on what town the elder lives in. Or you can go online and file it online. We do ask that if it's an emergency, that you call the centralized intake unit rather than file the report online. On the weekends, we don't have workers that are regularly checking what we refer to as the queue. So they're only checked once in the morning and then again at 5 o'clock. So if there's an emergency that needs to be responded to kind of sooner rather than later on the weekend or after hours, we won't be notified till the next business day unless you contact the centralized intake unit. And we do ask that you try to give as much information as possible about the elder and that situation when you do file. Next slide, please, Cheryl. If you're not sure if you should file a report or not, you can always give us a call. Our contact information is listed there. There's always one of us kind of on manning the queue or ready for consult. So if you lose our contact information, you just call HESCO and ask for the receptionist to put you in touch with the PS supervisor for the day, and she'll connect you over to us. And so after you've made a report, we review the report and we decide if it meets regulations for an investigation. During this time, the only person that we are able to contact is the reporter. So we can't contact, doctors or any collaterals. So that's why we do ask, if somebody is filing the report, that they have firsthand information, not that they report what they've seen and have somebody else file. If it is screened out and a mandated reporter is the person who reported, then we have to call and discuss the reason for screening out. If it's screened in, the case is assigned to a worker and it's open for investigation. Next slide, please. So if it is screened in, there are 3 different types of responses that can be given. So an emergency response is that it needs to be responded to within 5 hours. We need to try and alleviate that emergency risk. A rapid response will be responded to within 24 hours, and a routine response is within 5 days, excuse me. And the worker will have 30 days to complete the investigation. So one of the things that our workers, and that's been mentioned, even during this training, one of the things that's very crucial to, what's going to steer the events of the investigation is whether or not the elder has the capacity to consent. And elders have the right to consent to protective services. And this means basically their ability to reach an informed decision, including an understanding to the risks and consequences of their choices. Mental health concerns such as dementia do not necessarily indicate that an elder does not have capacity. So some of the steps of an investigation generally include an initial home visit. This is when the worker reviews all the allegations and risk factors with the elder, assesses their capacity using an IDA, obtains collateral contact information, maybe doctors' names, other family members, and they do a general interview with the elder. So
Yes,
again,
do you have an omelet of the day?
is there any way we could? Thank you. So an elder does have the right to refuse to
Of the
participate.
day.
An elder has the right to participate or to refuse in the PS investigation. So if they don't want to talk to us, then that is their choice. The initial home visits are generally unannounced unless there is a safety risk. And we feel that maybe going there unannounced would further increase the risk to the elder. We would not do that. And then when we're contacting collaterals, some of the general ones or typical ones include the primary care doctors, caregivers, home care case managers, family members, and other service providers. We are able, if an elder has refused to participate in investigation, we are able to still contact mandated reporter collaterals. Next slide, please. So when preparing to speak with a collateral, every PSW must speak with the supervisor first to get approval to speak with that collateral to ensure a couple things, but basically what we refer to as the balance test. So when we're doing the balance test or talking about the balance test, we want to know, will speaking with this collateral increase the risk to the elder? And some of the things that we look at in determining that is this collateral going to document this conversation in their file? Is there a risk that somebody else would be able to read it? Will the collateral tell another professional that protective service is involved? Will that collateral speak with the alleged perpetrator? Will they inform the alleged perpetrator that protective services is involved? Which can significantly increase the risk to the elder if that happens. And is there a connection between the reported allegation and the collateral? And what will the potential information obtained outweigh the elder's right to privacy? So those are some of the things we look at when we're determining who we can and cannot speak to. So there are two types of communication that can occur. And we refer to them as MDR or ADR. So the minimal discretionary release is no allegations are revealed. We ask only open-ended questions and kind of use reflective listening and maybe ask questions based off of what the collateral is already providing us. For an additional discretionary release, the allegations may be revealed. Targeted questions may be used to obtain specific information. So an example of an additional, an ADR release might be something like, have you ever noticed, a family member yelling at the elder? Or have you ever seen any bruises or anything like that? Whereas MDR might be, do you have any concerns? Next slide, please. So in order for us to substantiate, we need to have 51% believing that the information gathered is true. And this is just for a reasonable person to look at the information that we've collected and say, yes, this is likely what is going on. And if so, the case is then moved into ongoing services. If it's unsubstantiated and all allegations are unsubstantiated, then all records are purged after 1 year. That means they're gone from the system. We no longer have access to it. Substantiated cases of physical abuse, severe neglect, and financial exploitation are referred to the district attorney's office from us. Next slide, please. So once an investigation has been completed and the allegations are substantiated, our workers will service plan with the elder to reduce the risk to them. So service plans often include referrals to the community partners and resources, including elder services agencies, VNA, housing, money management, assisted living, and long-term care facilities. Next slide. And again, an elder with capacity to consent has the right to refuse protective service planning. So an elder, our worker may say, okay, we're going to make a home care referral, going to get some services in here to help you with your ADLs and IADLs, going to greatly reduce the risk. It's going to be great. The elder has the right to say, no, thank you. I, met with you that one time during the investigation. I don't want any referrals and I don't want you to call me again. And we have to kind of respect the elder's wishes. Next slide, please. So everyone has a role to play in preventing elder abuse and the impact on our society as a whole. So I think with the help of everyone, you can help build support for all our elders so everyone can thrive as they age. And that's all I have. So we'll open it up for questions.
So there is a question in the chat that asks, how many protective service workers are currently on your team?
So currently we have 4 PSWs. We actually have a 5th that's coming on board next week, so we will be fully staffed. So we have 5 PSWs, 2 supervisors, and myself as the director. The program itself has grown tremendously. When I first started working with HESCO, there were 2 full-time protective service workers, 1 part-time, and 1 supervisor. Now we've added to where we have 5 full-time workers, 2 full-time supervisors, and myself as the program director. So, and I do think our area, we're one of the smaller agencies, and I think the potential is there for us to continue growing as well, because we know the need is really out there.
Thank you, Kara. Another question in the chat is, can a Council on Aging outreach worker or director ask for an update on a senior they are concerned about?
So that's a great question. It's not a cut or dry answer, because it's really going to depend on a case-by-case basis. What we can share, we will share. There are some times though we might not be able to share specific information due to our own confidentiality guidelines. As the reporter, you will get a follow-up letter after 45 days that tells the determination of the case, whether we substantiated or not substantiated. Moving forward beyond that, in cases with an elder having capacity, we would need consent from them to share any information. And again, for elders not having capacity, we would have to feel that it meets the balance test to share specific information. So I guess the answer would be maybe we could, but I can't guarantee that in every case. I will say that if we have a concern for the safety of someone who might be going into the home for whatever reason, that kind of information we would absolutely share, so that we're not putting any additional people at risk.
Thank you, Kara. So the next question is in the chat as well, and it says, how do you know if the elder has capacity?
Another great question. So part of the elder interview is a structured interview called interview for decisional abilities. This was specifically developed by, I always mix it up, it's either NYU or Columbia University in New York City, specifically for Massachusetts Adult Protective Services. It is a structured interview that helps us take the elder through the risks in general of a situation like theirs, and then their specific risks in their scenario, and it ferrets out, are they able to sort of weigh the pros and cons? Are they able to appreciate the risks or not? Or do they seem to have an understanding? From that interview, if the worker does that interview and is like, not quite sure that this person really understands the risk, we would then seek out the PCP, first of all, if they have one, to get a statement on capacity. If they don't have a PCP, which happens frequently, and the risk is high enough, we then have a doctor that we contract with who would go in and do a capacity evaluation in their home for us. And then based on that findings that would then determine our next steps. There have been times where we've sent her out and she's like, yep, this person does not have capacity. And then other ones, no, they still retain capacity. So, we are seeking, a neuropsychologist, a professional who's trained in this to give us that final answer. But we start with the IDA, the interview for decisional abilities, and that must be completed in every case. The only times it's not completed is if there's a language difference. Like we can't, like if somebody speaks only Spanish and my caseworker doesn't speak Spanish, we can't complete the IDA through a translator. But I do have a couple workers who are bilingual in like Haitian Creole and things, and so they could do an IDA if they needed to in that native language. It has to be done in the person's native language. That is the one sort of caveat to it. But if we have any questions, we do follow up with either their PCP or bring in our own doctor.
We don't have any more questions in the chat. Please feel free to put more questions in the chat or unmute yourself and ask your question verbally if you want to. Do we have any other questions? Okay, I do see a couple coming in through the chat. One says, for neglect reports, are police violating any records laws by sending report to HESCO?
No, as mandated reporters, and we do have the ability to receive police reports. We do understand that some things, if it's an active investigation, can't be released to us, and things, certain things need to be redacted, but we do have, it's not violating any laws to release that information to us. And it's certainly not violating any laws if you're reporting a neglect situation or reporting any kind of situation, because the police are considered mandated reporters. So you are protected by that.
And will we also be able, Kara, to send these slides out to all
Sure.
of the attendees?
Yeah, we can do that.
Are there any other questions? And people can feel free to unmute themselves or put a question into chat.
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
Were you folks, are you able to, if someone is in need of seeking legal guardianship?
I'm sorry, I can't, it's kind of garbled. I can't really hear what you're saying. Can you just repeat? Or
Are you folks able to help someone if they are in need of seeking legal guidance? Are you able to hear me?
Legal guidance, sound like a Metro West number we would give. I couldn't hear, I just heard something along the lines of we're able to give legal guidance.
Oh, no, go for legal guardianship.
Oh, guardian.
Legal guardian.
guardianship. Okay.
Okay.
So I believe it's Melissa that might be speaking. It's coming through very garbled, and so it might be easier if you put it into chat.
Okay, I will do that. I'm sorry.
Sorry, I can start talking about legal guardianship. Yes, we can pursue legal guardianship. That is the absolute 100% last thing we look to do. So if we end up doing that, it's because we've tried everything else. And the risk level, the other piece is the risk level has to be high enough for us to justify taking away someone's decisional rights about themselves. So However, that said, we will do that if it is necessary in a case. We first try to find family members or someone involved close by who might be willing to serve as a guardian. If not, we do have some agencies. There are very limited state slots that we can access, but again, that's very limited. So we can access, but we can seek guardianship for somebody, same with conservatorship. But again, it's not something, we're not going to get a case and just immediately jump to guardianship. Most of the time we've been involved in a case for some time. We've tried a bunch of other things, and this is what we need to do now. Again, if you're looking at the theory of adult protection, the least restrictive alternative, you don't get more restrictive than guardianship. So that really has to be our last resort on that.
Thank you. We've got another question in chat. Is it useful or helpful to report multiple times if you know another agency has reported and you are seeing the same issues?
I would say it is very helpful to report. Even if we've already had the report from somebody else, you might have a different perspective. You might have additional information that we don't have, or that other person who reported doesn't have. So, I would say don't hesitate to report. We would rather you report, and then, if we call you back and say, hey, we want to try this first, or, and end up screening it out, that's fine. We would rather you report than not report. And again, we often get multiple reports on people for the same incident, from different providers. And that is very helpful because it helps us paint a fuller picture of what might actually be going on in a situation. So yeah, please don't ever feel like you shouldn't report. We're like Courtney said, we're happy to consult. If you're on the fence, not really sure of a situation, give us a call. We'll talk you through it. We'll listen. But if you also want to jump ahead and just report, you can do that too. So.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions in the chat. Does anyone else have questions? We'll do one final call for questions before we wrap up.
And if people do think of questions after the fact, please feel free to email or call me. I am available, or Courtney and Aletha are also available to answer any questions that might come up after the fact.
I think you had a slide, Kara, with your contact information.
Yes, there is a slide with the contact information.
Show it on the screen now, and then we'll send
you just passed it. Yeah. Oh.
That's the central intake unit.
Yeah, and then the next one should have our contact. There you go. So we appreciate everybody coming to this webinar. Our hope is in the future to do additional events for World Elder Abuse Awareness Day. I know other agencies have organized walks and things like that, and our goal is to move towards different events to bring better awareness to this issue in the community, so that we really can support all of our elders in the community and get them the help that they need.
All right, with that, thank you all for coming. As Kara said, we really appreciate you attending. And HESCO we will send out these slides to all of you who attended. And we will also post this video on our YouTube channel. So if you know people who missed it, we will have the presentation available. Thank you.
Thank you.